Hello, welcome to this YouTube channel. Today we will discuss on the particular poem The Prologue by Anne Bradstreet. As you can see, this particular poem falls under the group of American literature and it is in your CC-T-5 paper. Now before going to this particular poem The Prologue, let us know something about the poet or rather poetess Anne Bradstreet. Bradstreet was born in a wealthy Puritan family in Northampton. As you could know, it is in England. Her early works read in the style of Du Bertus. When we will read this particular poem, the prologue, you will find that this particular name, Du Bertus, who is a French poet, ultimately his name has been mentioned by Bradstreet in this particular poem, that is the prologue. What happens to know that her later writing developed into her unique style of poetry. But ultimately, whenever we find to read the early poems by Anne Bradstreet, we find that these were being influenced by any other author. It might be Du Bertus, it might be the eminent writers of the Renaissance period who were writing in the English forms. The typical unique style of poetry which centers on her role as a mother, her struggles, her sufferings of life, and her puritanical stance. All these things have been described and rather discussed in her poems. Her first collection, the Tenth Muse, lately sprung up in America, was widely read in America as well as in England. This particular poem, that is the prologue, it was taken from this particular collection, that is the Tenth Muse, lately sprung up in America. The first section of the Tenth Muse, as you can find, it includes the long poems known as quaternions. It chiefly, there you will find the poems like the Four Elements, the long narrative poems by Four Elements, the Four Humors of Man, the Four Ages of Man, and also the Four Seasons. As you can find that whenever we read the particular formations of literature, we find that the four primal elements are considered to be very important, and these consist of earth, air, fire, and water. The first group of poems, that is the Four Elements, you will find that these are actually focusing on these four elements. If you think of the Four Humors, as we know that Renaissance period was governed by the humors. Okay, the theory of humors, as we know, Ben Jonson's comedy of humors actually existed during this time period. You will find that these, that is the humor poems, these were actually focusing on choler and blood and melancholy and phlegm, all are there. The third set, the four stages of humankind, these are actually focusing on childhood and also youth and middle age and old age, where the four seasons, these are focusing on spring, summer, winter, and etc. So ultimately, whenever we read Bradstreet, you will find that Bradstreet is chiefly known for using her poetry as a means of question or questioning her own Puritan beliefs, her doubt concerning God's mercy, and her struggles to continue to place her faith in Him. Some notable poems of Bradstreet are verses upon the burning of our house and in memory of my dear grandchild. Much of her poetry is based on observation of the world around her, focusing heavily on domestic and religious themes. The role of woman is a common subject found in Bradstreet's poems. Living in a typical Puritanic society, you will find that Bradstreet didn't approve of the stereotypical idea that women were inferior to men during the year of 1600 and so. Women were expected to spend all their time cooking, cleaning, taking care of the children, and attending to their husband's every need. These were somehow being incorporated in the typical patriarchal representation of women as we could find in the eminent texts by eminent authors. Somehow, these were negated by Anne Bradstreet in her writings. If you think of this particular poem, that is the Prologue, you will find that this is published in the year 1650 in the Tenth Muse, lately sprung up in America. Fundamentally, you will find that the prologue, or with this particular poem, Anne Bradstreet actually steps out of her home and gets acquainted with the scary and hostile world of public writing. The poem demonstrates how society used to underestimate the poetic accomplishments of women. The popular belief that women should be doing other things, like the household activities, like the sewing, as you can find here, because the needle has been mentioned there in this particular poem, rather than writing poetry. Probably you have heard of this particular work by Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own. When Virginia Woolf tried to identify the female authors by browsing the history of English literature, she couldn't find ample names to do so. And Virginia Woolf wrote a particular section in her A Room of One's Own. Judith Shakespeare, probably you have heard of the name, that if Shakespeare was a female, then what would be the fortune for her? In Judith Shakespeare, Virginia Woolf actually proposing, or she is actually focusing, that if Shakespeare was not a male figure, if she was a female, then probably we could not find Shakespeare at all. Why? Because it is patriarchy that was actually controlling the fate of the women of this time period. Do you think that any eminent female figures in the Elizabethan period or in the Jacobean period, they couldn't write anything? Probably not. So where lies the problem? Or where lied the problem at the time? It is indicating towards the patriarchal subjugation. The females, or the female authors rather, they were forced to be encapsulated, or maybe rather imprisoned within the four walls of domestic duties and obligations. This particular poem, the Prologue, this actually indicates, or rather hints, towards the condition of women during Renaissance, the condition of women during this particular time period, the early 1700s or early say 17th century, and at the same time it is focusing on some ironic shaft regarding the presentation of women, regarding the controlling of women, regarding the subjugation of women, and also regarding the exploitation of women. Now, what happens to be a truth, whenever we will read this particular poem, the Prologue, the fundamental question will be focused on how do we consider the poem? Is it a feminist discourse? Or rather, here you will find the ironic representation of women, the patriarchal subjugation has been pointed by Anne Bradstreet to this particular poem? Or rather, in another form, you will find that this particular poem is a poem of humility. Rather, you will find that the way of the world that has been followed by Anne Bradstreet, where you have to think about the progenitors, you have to think about your great-grandfathers, like Shakespeare or Sidney or others. So, from which particular angle we should treat this particular poem, that is the Prologue by Anne Bradstreet? Should we consider this particular poem is actually indicating towards a question towards patriarchy or against patriarchy? Or rather, the way Anne Bradstreet is presenting herself as if do not having such power do not having such talent? Is it simply a kind of poem of humility? So, from which particular angle we should read this poem, it will be discussed in our next lecture. Thank you.